We only call serious students.
Okay, take a look at. I know that since we've started, she hasn't really missed any class. So if she's not here today, there has to be a reason. So I talked about for anything text, whether paragraph or so on, you can use text align and get away with it. But for anything inside a parent, which is like this div, this h2 is a child of the parent. Sorry. So what we can do is on the parent, and I just put this box so that we can easily see where the div is starting and ending. Does that make sense? So let me make the width, let me make the width maybe 50 VH as well, or maybe 60, not VH, is what? V width, right? So taking a look at this, you can also see that our div itself is not positioned at the center. For something like this div now, we can use a margin of auto. We can't use text align for the div, obviously, because the div is not. When we use text align center for the div, it's going to affect its children. You get, so let's say this, we don't have text align on this h2. It is still going to take inherit the text align property from the div. Does that make sense? That's inheritance, right? So you see that the text align doesn't have any impact on the div itself, but when we do something like margin auto, it will have an impact on the div. Can you see that it's now pushed to the center now, horizontally, and it should be pushed to the center vertically, just that the body is as high as what? The highest child inside of it, which is in this case the div. Do you get the point?
Okay, sir.
So if we give the div a body and we give it a height, if we give the body a height of 100 VH, see what happens to this div now. So this is the body and then this is the div. Sorry about it. Okay, I'm trying to find out why it's not. So basically the margin should get applied. So let me just explain it. So that's this div.
Please, can I quickly ask a quick question?
Okay.
Your inspection, like the inspection tab normally be at the top. Mine used to be vertically, and I always want to try to bring it to be down.
So
I don't need to get it.
okay, if you want to do that, you see this top tab here where you have element console, blah blah blah. Just go to the extreme, which is these 3 dots, and click on it.
Yes.
Then you will see the options. You can even bring it out of the window, so you can put it to the right.
Okay, thank you very much.
You can put it to the bottom, so that works. So in the light of that, so you see margin auto. Hello?
I want to ask a quick question, sir. Okay, sir, I don't know. I'm mixing this up. What is the difference between display block and display flex?
Okay. So when we have an inline element, for instance, like a span, okay, let me just put a span inside of the body. Span, and let me say inline element. A span by default is an inline element, right? And then a button also is an inline element, right? So we have those two, and you can see that they are side by side. So I can target the span, and let me just reduce this a little bit. I can decide to target the span element and give the display of block, and watch what happens to it. It takes the full block. You get the point? You can see it takes the entire width now, which is what block level elements do. Does that make sense? But the button is still an inline element, and if you can look at it, you can see that it's inline by inspection. It's an inline element, which is the default. You can see displays inline block. So I can decide to override that by using my own custom, what's it called? I can decide to override that by using my own custom CSS rule to override the default HTML rule. Does that make sense? Hello?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so you can do that. So the difference between display block just gives the element a display of block, as again if it is a div by default having a display of inline or inline block. Does that make sense? An inline block puts them side by side. But display of flex is applicable to a parent basically that has children inside of it, which is like this difference. And let me just remove these two elements now. So it's applicable to something like this div inside of the body. Okay, we already know that this is the body tag. I don't know why that is actually. Okay, this is the body tag, and inside of the body tag we have the div, right? And inside of the div we have the h2, and you can see how the nesting just goes on. So the body already takes 100% of the viewport height, right? Then the div is just 60%, sorry, 50% of the viewport height, which is 50% VH. So what you can do with display flex is on the body, you can give the body a display of flex. And the reason why you are doing that is so that it behaves like a flex box, and that is it allows everything inside of it to be able to position across every width available in the body. Does that make sense? That is, for every child inside of that element that you are giving a display of flex, it will be able to take in as much room as it is as available in that parent element. That is, this is the parent tag, which is the body tag. Initially when we did a margin of auto on the div, it only aligned it horizontally, it didn't align it vertically initially. You get the point? Before we did a display of flex, let me just remove display of flex. We did a display of margin of auto on this, and it only places it horizontally. In as much as there's still enough space in the body to take vertically, it doesn't take it. You get it? So, but once you make an element a display of flex, every space in it to be accessible to its children, from the top to the bottom and from the left to the right. Does that make sense? And that's why you can do things like justify content flex end, because the flex end is now accessible. You can now do things like justify content, flex start, and position it whichever way you want, whether to the extreme end, to the center, or to the beginning. So that's what display flex makes available to you. So as it stands now, we can only position it across the height it occupies. And if I reduce the height of that div inside of it to 30 pixels, it is just going to still be positioned to the center horizontally, but it won't be able to extend towards the vertical axis. So for it to be able to use this margin auto on the div, you have to be able to give its parent a display of flex, and that it is going to take automatic margin on the left and right, then automatic margin at the top and bottom. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
So to be able to put this at the center now, you give the body a display of flex, and then with the margin auto on that div, it automatically positions it at the center. But if you decide not to use auto margin on all axes, you can decide this margin is a shorthand property for margin top, margin bottom, margin left, and margin right. You understand that, right?
Yes, sir.
You don't understand?
I do.
Okay, you understand. So we can do this. We can say auto for the top, we can say 5 pixels for the right, we can say auto for the bottom, we can say 10 pixels for the left. And this is going to be big confusion in our page, because you get, but you can see that it actually takes it takes the margin based on the proportion we set. But you can see that the margin top and bottom are actually equal because we said auto, so it will divide it evenly across both axes. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
So you can use display of flex on a parent and then use margin auto, just one margin auto on the child, to position it to the center, both along the horizontal axis and the vertical axis, that is the X and Y axis. But if you don't want to use margin auto, what you can do is to do display of flex, you do justify content center, then you do align items center as well, and that will give you the very same output, which is what we've been doing all this while. Do you understand that?
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Yes,
okay.
Sir.
Yeah, and we can do the same for the H2. So you can see that for the H2 now we are giving a margin of auto, but you can see that it's not really consequential because the H2 is a block level element and it is taking the entire width of our div. Does that make sense? Block level element takes all the width available in their parent. So if we decide to set the width of our H1, the width of our H1 to, let's say, 50%. So you see that our item will still be centralized, but you see that the real estate that the H2 actually takes is now reduced, but it's taking auto margin on left and right. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
So if I remove this margin auto, it is going to be positioned at the center, but the problem is that the center will now be relative to the width of what? The H2. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
It makes sense, man. And remember that
Yes.
by default, H2 always come with default margin. And that's why you're seeing that margin around it. So if you come and use the universal selector, for instance, use the universal selector to remove default margin, and padding from all our elements, you will see that, we don't have that margin at the top and bottom anymore, but we have margin all across the right hand side, and that is by default. Once the width is not equal to the total width of the parent, it leaves the rest as margin. But now we can now by ourselves manipulate how we want the margin to behave. So we can now decide to come here now and say, okay, we want a margin of auto across both axes, or one auto on the right, and then 110 pixels, auto at the top, then 110 pixels, at the left and right, on the left and right axis. So we can do that now. When we do that, you will see that when we inspect our element, you see how small the margin is on the left, but the right still takes that auto margin, because that's how things really behave, in CSS and HTML together. Because once an element is half of the width, the rest will have to be margin. Remember what I said about margin? It is the neighborhood. So if you buy one plot, everywhere outside the one plot is your neighborhood. You get the point? Yeah. So for us to be able to use this margin auto now to position this across the X and Y axis, what do you think we need to do now?
So to put it across X and Y.
Yes. What do we do? There are two ways based on what I discussed so far, right? So what are the two ways I talked about? And at this point in time, people of God, just turn on your camera.
I don't have light.
Turn on your camera. I said turn on your camera. Plenty of people just left. Okay, so guys, so I just talked about two ways, the two different ways you can do that. Hello? Have you guys been following me at all?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, now if you've been following, let's bring this home. Let's drive it home. Or how do they speak that English? Let's drive it home. Let's drive it home. Please. Please and please. I mentioned two ways. I said you can either use a display of flex is always applicable, because I said flex boxes make every area inside of a parent accessible to the children. You understand that when I said that, right? So I now said you can either decide to, when you want to position a child in the center of a parent, whether across the horizontal or vertical axis, you can decide to use display flex on the parent, which is what we are doing here on the body. Yeah. Display flex on the parent, then margin auto on the child. I said that right?
So, is it possible to give the child itself a display of flex?
When you give a child a display of flex, it is going to be applicable to the children in it, not to itself. Does that make sense?
Okay. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
So you give the parent a display of flex to make it a flex box. And a flex box is basically going to make every area of its width and height available to its children for rendering them. So you can now combine whatever property in CSS you want to combine with that display of flex you're giving to the parent. Whether by putting a margin auto on the child, or by doing justify content center on the parent and align item center on the parent. Does that make sense? So that's what we want to do to this H2 now. So at the moment it has margin of auto, so we can remove margin of auto for now, or let's leave margin of auto for now. So the moment we give a display of flex to the parent, which is this div here, I can see margin auto actually puts it, puts it in the center, but horizontally, but the vertical landmark is still not available to it, not accessible to it, and that will be accessible only when we make this div have a display of flex. And when we do that, it's just going to, like magic, make available all that room that we need, display of flex. So I'll save that and see what happens, just like magic. So it makes what, both the entire space along the vertical axis and the entire space along the horizontal axis accessible to the element, to the child. Is it clear? So I said the other alternative to doing margin auto on the child is to put a display of flex on the parent like this. Then you will now do a justify content center on the parent, which is what, aligning it horizontally. Can you see? It's going to push it along the horizontal axis. Then you are going to do align items center as well to align it vertically. Does that make sense? So it solves the same problem, but there are two different approaches now, and there's just one another approach we can use. So the other approach we can use, as against doing justify content center, align item center, because you might want to make each and every item in your flexbox behave differently. So you can also do something like this. You can do align self on the child, not on the parent, align self center, and it gives you the same thing that you get when you do align items on the parent. Are you seeing that? Then I believe you can also do, I think there's justify self. Yeah, justify self center also does what justify content center on the parent would have been able to, obtain for you. Okay, that didn't move that. I'm guessing that. Okay, align self. So justify self. Let me see what. Let me actually test too. Maybe justify. Okay, let me just justify any self, whatever. Justify self. Place self. Is it place self? Center. So I think what you can do is combine okay, place self replaces align self. So I think you can combine this together with margin auto along the x and y axis, and that places that center for you as well. But I think the point is just for you to know that there are different approaches you can use to solve these problems. Do you understand that? So it's just for you to know, have your best methods. For me, I just use align items on the parent, justify content on the parent most of the time, except when I need to place each items, use different alignment for each item inside the flexbox. That's when I explore other options. But as against doing all of this, you can just do, align items center on the parent. Remember, I'm doing this on the parent, and justify content center on the parent, and that gives you the exact same behavior you're looking for. So you can place this at the center without having any worry. It doesn't matter how small the screen becomes, it still stays at the center. As against you trying to manipulate the margin by doing something like, okay, you want to place it at the center. Okay, here we go. So you now do margin. Okay, let me save this now because you want it to be at the center. So the first thing you do is first do margin top of 30 pixels and test it to see if it works. Then when you do like this, you say, okay, it's almost there. Then you come here and increase it to 50 and be like, wow, we are almost there. You understand what I'm talking about? So technically, this is not very scalable, because as the screen becomes smaller, you actually see that item you thought was in the center will gradually start deviating from that center you thought you put it on the particular screen you're developing from. Does that make sense?
That's all.
Can you see now? Because you forced the margin and it has to retain that absolute value. See, it's no longer inside its parent. It is now a prodigal son. as a prodigal child. So that's that about that. I think that's clear enough, but so understand the fact that you see there are more than enough CSS properties for you to be able to cram or even memorize. So you just have to know which one solves which problems for you. You get the point? And I remember Sammy talking about in the last class, telling you about the fact that you can always go to Google. You can say, how do I place items in the center of a div? You will see that the solutions you get will be nothing so different from what we've been doing. You can see you can do this by setting the display of to flex, then define align items and justify content property to center. You get that? Like that's the first thing that the average person will think about once you have an understanding of those things. Then when you now want to do some in-depth stuff, you can now decide to kind of explore other options that are available, like margin, auto, align self, and there are many ways to actually go about that particular problem. But I think this solves the problem for you. So let's just move to our subject of debugging. So Jesus, this computer is just becoming slower, and let me see if so we just use it like that. Sorry about that. So what we're going to do now is let's use this same code to debug, and then let's just do some debugging with this code. Or okay. So I'm just going to set some random properties on this element, and I want us to be able to find out, where whatever errors we are getting is coming from.